This is a session I've been looking forward to because the Broadband Development Office, as many of you know, has been on a listening tour all across the state. We have the great privilege of having Catherine DeWitt, who's the project director for the Broadband Access Initiative with the Pew Charitable Trust, with us. And she works at the national level with state broadband directors all across the country. So we're going to have her interview Greg Conte, who's the director of the Broadband Development Office. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
Why, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking with us for the day. This is going to be just a brutal 30 minutes. No, I'm kidding. I won't do that to Greg or all of you. But hello, it's always great to be in Texas, really because of what we have going on right here today. Just the community of folks that are here who are excited to support and show up and help Texans help other Texans. And as Kelty mentioned, I lead a team of researchers and advocates and specialists who work with states all across the country to, really prepare to implement all these billions of federal dollars that are coming forward. And what we are doing here today, this situation where you have all these stakeholders coming in from across the state, this level of enthusiasm, this excitement, this focus on solutioning, this is not happening across the country. So while there has been a lot of discussion today and at other points about the state's readiness, and I know that people are concerned about that, is the state behind the curve? Are we ready? Are we ready to go? You're okay. You're in good shape. And I would also argue, too, that because we are in this unprecedented moment of funding, of policy, that in some ways the state is better positioned to create something new. Because this isn't, I hate the phrase, we're building the plane as we fly it in general, but especially as applied to this situation, because we're not building a plane, we are carving a new path. And that's really important to note and take note of because we are capitalizing on this opportunity to build a new foundation, whether we frame it as building a new foundation for the economy, education, healthcare, it's all of it, right? But it's important to really look at this moment for the opportunity that it is. Chris talked about it earlier as, and of course I didn't actually write it down on my notes because of course I didn't, calling this moment in history. It was so eloquent, I just completely butchered it. But I'm not here to be Greg's hype woman. No? I'm here to be the state's hype woman. Yeah. No, I'm kidding. But I did just want to take a moment to talk about why this moment is so historical and why it's so significant. And it's not just because of the billions of dollars that are coming forward. It's because there has never been a time before where the federal government has provided funds to states to administer for infrastructure, affordability, and adoption programs. So not only are we looking at new goals and policy around universal access, around affordable universal access, as Lonnie talked about earlier, no more cherry picking. This is about building affordable, equitable access from the beginning. That's new. So this is going to be a fun exercise. Mm-hmm. It's the right exercise because those policies have failed until now, so we need to fix it. We got to fix the market. But we are entering a new phase of policy and implementation. So let's talk about where the state of Texas is and all of that. Greg, yes. You are fresh off of your rock band tour of the state. I'm kidding. You're fresh off of 12 cities and 12 engagements around the state of listening to folks talk to you about what is going well and what is not going well, what the digital divide looks like in their communities. So talk to us about what you heard and what you didn't hear.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So one of the first things we did, we do have a state broadband plan. When HB 5 was going to legislative session, one of the talking points was that Texas is one of 6 states that doesn't have a state broadband plan. What is a broadband plan? It's essentially, what is the state going to do? How are we going to do alignment across the state to address the digital divide in the state? And so as as that date came closer, so we have that due in June. Back in January, we had a conversation, myself, Comptroller Hager, and a few other staff, talked about how do we want to execute this? How do we want to ensure that the broadband plan isn't something that's coming from Austin down onto the rest of the state of Texas, says this is how we're doing it. We want to make sure that it was a stakeholder-driven process. It was involvement from all Texans. And so we decided to do a statewide listening tour. At the time, we kind of were back and forth. Do we want to do it in person? Do we want to do it virtual? But we decided pretty much last minute that let's just do it. And Comptroller Hager looked at the schedule. He said, here's the 12 days I'm available in the next 2 months. Let's make it happen. And so we picked one location within each of the comptroller economic regions. And we went into that community and held a town hall style listening tour session. Wasn't us talking to the crowd, it was the crowd talking to us, letting us know about their broadband readiness, their access issues, and basic recommendations for our office. We're a brand new office, we're brand new to the state of Texas. The comptroller's office does a lot of things that HB 5 requires. Local government collaboration, map building, we have an IT team. We have a SECO, State Energy Conservation Office, that takes federal funds and brings them down to local governments. So a lot of these things we have best practices. When it came to broadband, that wasn't our forte. So we wanted to go make sure this process was a stakeholder-driven process. We partnered up with Ernst & Young to provide us assistance with that process as far as administering the actual tour itself, but as well as the data collection and the development. They're helping us with development of the map, development of the broadband plan as well. So a lot of the testimonies we heard and a lot of the audience members who attended these were across the spectrum. We had local ISPs, larger incumbents, local community members, and then business owners, government employees, local elected officials, even state elected officials who would show up when we were in their areas as well. So we got to hear from a wide range of folks. From the local community perspective, we heard a lot about make this easy for us. Don't make this so hard that we have to go out and hire contractors, engineers, all of that to access this funds. Okay, that makes sense to us. That makes a lot of sense, and we're certainly taking that feedback, and as we're developing our grant process, which we'll do following this state broadband plan, which we'll put out next month, we'll begin to establish those grant application processes and what that looks like. But a lot of what we need to do through that requires some compliance oversight and ensuring that sub-grantees, because that's essentially who would be receiving those funds. We'd be the grantees, ISPs and communities would be the sub-grantees. Sub-grantees need to meet certain qualifications based upon federal guidelines. And a lot of that is not easy. Some of the layers that the federal government, whether it's Treasury through CPF funding, and I think we'll talk about that soon, as well as NTIA, what we're seeing from the NOFO as well, there's a lot of layers that are within those requirements for sub-grantees. So that's something that we want to make this, we want to streamline this application process, but we also need to follow federal guidelines along that as well. So that's something we're thinking about. And as we use exclusive federal funding for this process, we'll need to follow those guidelines. What we also heard too was kind of to echo some of the things we're hearing about here, kind of the devices that communities were received, whether they're school children or community members who were receiving devices, whether they're computers, laptops, tablets, but the hotspots too. The hotspots that's great. Hotspots are wonderful. They're a fast Band-Aid. But if you don't even have access to mobile connectivity, your hotspots are essentially just paperweights. So it's something to consider when you're thinking about devices, and we've heard it here before as well too. Devices are pretty useless unless you have the access to get onto the internet and utilize them. So again, as we continue to focus our strategies on how we're going to spend this funding, we're considering a lot of that feedback. We've heard from local ISPs that want to make sure that that they're also considered in this process. We've heard from larger ISPs who say, hey, focus on those with the experience who have done this before and who can confirm or assert that we can execute these projects. So we're hearing from a lot of different areas. We're hearing from community members or elected officials too about their preparedness, their stories of either successes or failures through grant processes, whether it's NTIA's previous grant process, where Sabine County won $13 million, or other areas where they've been developing their broadband plans to some areas that don't even know where to begin, and everything in between. And that's helping us develop things like the toolkit that we have online to help something similar that everybody has on their table that the Texas Rural Funders developed. What can communities start doing now? We're talking about if you're not already starting to get to that point where you're ready to understand what you're going to ask for when we start putting applications online, get to that point, because it isn't going to be, hey, I have bad broadband, where's my bag of cash? Oh, here it is, sir. There's a lot of things that happen in between that process. And so we're trying and we're continuously updating that toolkit to help communities understand what the needs are from them as they attempt to move through this competitive process that we're establishing.
And I think it's important to add that these plans and the stakeholder engagement process that y'all engage in, you're providing really vital input to this plan that will eventually inform the state's goals, the metrics that they establish to measure success, but you're also informing the communication that they are providing to the federal government to say, hey folks, here's what's not gonna work at the local level, and let me tell you why. And it will help for helping them really make sure that this program is working for Texans. And to Greg's earlier point, some of the federal requirements may be easier to implement in some places than others. So the more that y'all participate in these ongoing outreach efforts, the more feedback that y'all provide, the more you engage in these challenge processes and community engagement processes moving forward, the better that Greg and his colleagues and their partners are able to advocate for all of you with the federal government. So how is the actual state plan coming?
It's coming pretty well.
To be fair, you knew I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's coming pretty well. As I was sitting here, I'm kind of on email. We're going back and forth. So we still have a few drafts that have been going around, and so we should be seeing something like that. It's not going to be any issues as far as us getting that out on time. We took a lot of that data collection process, not only from the state broadband listening tour, as we're calling it, but we also did a lot of focus groups. We did online surveys. Comptroller Hager talked about over 16,000 Texans participated in that online survey process. And we continued to do that throughout that listening tour for folks who could not attend. One of the things that we talked about as far as how are we going to measure success through the listening tour, how are we going to ensure that it was a successful process? And I just wanted, one of the things that was first initiated was that I didn't want anybody to come back to us when that process was over and say, hey, I didn't have the ability to participate. My voice wasn't heard. That was something that I wanted to ensure that every Texan had the ability to participate in that process, whether it was through focus groups, direct conversations, listening tour, online survey. We had the online surveys, but if we're trying to address the digital divide, what if you don't have online? So we worked actually with TSLAC, we worked with TEA to provide hard copy English and Spanish surveys to disseminate through their network as well. We received faxed, which is astonishing. I'm like, I have a fax number. I've received faxed completed surveys. We received a ton of surveys in the mail, and so there's a lot of Texans out there from all corners of the state who understand the need that what we need to address. And so we want to ensure that every Texan, whether they had service or not, Comptroller Hager was doing radio ads promoting. We had an 800 number where you can actually call in and talk to one of us, where we'll go on our computer and fill out the survey for you while you talk to us over the phone. We want to make sure that data collection process was truly inclusive. Now, when we go beyond the plan, that collaboration doesn't end. I think that you heard a lot here from IIJA, that local government collaboration. We're going to have challenge processes. One on the FCC maps comes end of September. Local governments, local communities, we can challenge those maps. If those maps are inaccurate, Texas can receive more funding. So we want to make sure that those maps are correct, so Texas can receive as much funding as possible. Then come our maps. We're going to develop maps too. I was going to say maybe Lonnie Hunt can help our maps with his Dalmatian, but we've unfortunately, I know, yeah, we'll do. Well, we finalized an RFO process. We're right now in the process of reviewing the respondents to that, and we will be bringing something in to help us establish a state broadband availability map. Again, that address level fabric, what address has access or does not have access. That is the minimum viable product. We'll have have the schools pulled out as well and be able to assess and have a better idea of kind of quantifying what that digital divide in Texas looks like from an access perspective. Now we can certainly come back in, and we intend to do so. Those maps are intended to be completed in January. We can come back in, continue to gold plate those, whether we have assets, whether it's fiber lines, socioeconomic data, things like that we can also include in that helps us make better decisions as a state to address the digital divide from other aspects, not just from the access component. And so you, as a public, have the ability to challenge those maps too, to make sure that we have the most accurate data. And then lastly, through IIJA, we can get to that in a little bit, but we have the process on that as far as once we do our sub-grantee selection on that $1 to $4 billion that we're supposed to receive, you can challenge the accuracy of those decisions that we'll be making. And so the public has a lot of opportunity to work through this with us and to make sure that we're making the right decisions from a state and to make sure we're utilizing that funding in the most appropriate way. So long story short, after this plan gets dropped, we're going to keep planning. We're going to have a 5-year action plan. We're going to have an initial proposal. We're going to have a final proposal. We're going to have a state digital equity plan that rolls into that 5-year plan that will be addressing the needs of Texas too. So stay tuned.
And all the public policy nerds are saying, yes.
Yeah.
Love those plans. It's accountability. And that has been the thing that has been missing from federal broadband policy in particular for decades. And that is the strongest marker of the federal laws that have been passed, particularly in the last 14 months, has just been improved accountability within Congress. So let's pivot and talk about that. We've got two major pieces of legislation, American Rescue Plan Act, and then the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I believe we are now calling the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It has gone through a rebranding, the BIL. So American Rescue Plan Act funds, those monies will be coming available first. We talked earlier about the state and local fiscal recovery funds. A lot of flexibility in those funds. If I may make a plug for research from my organization, pewcharitabletrusts.org. We have several analyses on there about how state and local governments can use those funds and the level of flexibility within Rescue Plan Act dollars. But let's talk CAP projects. What's going on there?
Yeah, so I think that's like one thing that I didn't hear discussed today was our capital projects fund.
No one's talking about it.
No one's talking about it anymore. We received $500 million for broadband expansion initially through the ARPA umbrella, which is called the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund that is being administered by United States Treasury. Same concept here. States will receive block grants, which will use a competitive process to award sub-grantees funding for broadband expansion. The projects through the guidance, the idea on this funding was to kind of get a lot of this funding out the door. The fuse is already lit for it. These funds need to be expended by December of 2026. It needs to address 3 criteria areas. It needs to enable work, health, and education, and it needs to address communities that are in need from the coronavirus pandemic. And so we had several strategies in place on how to utilize the funding. We've received this funding. We were allocated the funding, I believe, back in October, November time, predates IIJA. So we've already signed the application, and so we have until September to begin drawing some of the all the funding down through grant plans that we submit to Treasury for approval. One of the strategies, well, a few of the strategies haven't worked out so far. One of the strategies we had was HB 1505 created a pole replacement program, which would essentially pay for poles that were in unserved areas of the state. So areas that are considered unserved, we would reimburse that funding up to $5,000 SB 8 or third special session, what it did was it gave our office $500 million, with that $75 million going to pole replacement programs. Treasury has released an FAQ at the end of April saying standalone pole replacement programs, i.e. 1505, but other states had 1505 equivalents, was non-eligible use for CPF funding. So essentially, we've established the structure for 1505 for a pole replacement program. However, the funding cannot come from Treasury. So that's just one wrinkle. We're going to work with our state legislatures on reconfiguring SB 8 on the third special session. Another one, what we did is right at the beginning when BDO was created, we created an interagency council on broadband expansion, kind of brought all of our state agencies together who are in the broadband ecosystem, just to kind of have alignment, talk about kind of what broadband projects are that are happening across the state. You know, your TxDOTs, TSLACs, your Parks and Wildlife, who runs mesh systems through their parks, and a bunch of different state agencies. And we've asked some of those state agencies to make proposals to us that we were intending to use some of the CPF funding on. TxDOT had some programs bringing broadband out to safety areas in West Texas. We've socialized that with Treasury, and they weren't too keen on that just because it didn't meet some of the requirements that Treasury is expecting. And some of those requirements are that affordability piece. We talked about that. Anybody who receives funding through CPF as well as IIJA must provide in a universal, affordable rate at 100/20. Now, what's affordable? Affordable is a definition that each state needs to come up with. So we need to define what affordable is. We need to determine that. I think a couple weeks ago, we saw an event on the Rose Garden in Washington, D.C., where we had 20 ISPs who are providing a $30 rate at 100/20 with ACP. So that's for ACP eligible households. That's free internet for them. So they have free internet at 100/20. So basically, anybody who participates with with IIJA or CPF needs to provide that affordable rate. I digress a little bit. So TxDOT, that program that they had, didn't really have that affordability piece, didn't really meet that some of the criteria. So we're working with Treasury on that now. All this said, there is criteria around how we're spending that funding through Treasury. We expect to see the same stringent rules through IIJA as well. And so we anticipate as the BDO to work within that. The lion's share of that $500 million that we'll receive from CPF we will develop a a program plan to submit to Treasury for a last mile connectivity program that we will have a competitive process for. That should be online, as Comptroller Hager was talking about this morning, sometime in September, October time. We will have that online for applications to begin rolling in. And again, it has that December 2026 deadline. CPF, Treasury, they consider an area unserved if it does not have that 100/20. So this funding can only be used in areas where it is not 100/20.
So I think that I'm going to make an unsolicited plug here. You know, we've been talking a lot about sort of the complexities of serving communities across the state today. And what we're running into right now with CPF, what's considered unserved in CPF is different than what is considered unserved under the requirements in the IIJA programs. So, unsolicited observation from the person working at the national level, you want to get people online faster in Texas, you get those hard to serve people who are considered underserved under IIJA, applying those funds with CPF towards those folks who are at 120. You're getting more Texans online faster. And if you're able to maximize the use of those existing networks, you're amplifying and extending and multiplying the use of federal funds. No one asked me. Greg's going to kick me later, but I'm just throwing it out there. So making most use of time, we've got about 6 minutes left. Let's talk about milestones that we have upcoming for BEAD. And because there are two other questions that I want to ask you after this. But I do just briefly want to note that if you look at the information that NTIA released last week, we've got a couple of key milestones coming up. One in July, one in August, one in late fall. And then after that, we're really looking at 2024 before funds probably roll out to the sub-grantees. So what are some short-term wins? And how will you be looking to work with all the folks in this room to hit those key milestones, and then between now and that 2024 deadline?
Yeah, so some of those key milestones, your letter of intent, as well as a request for the initial funds. The initial funds are $5 million that will go to each state that will go towards the planning components of BEAD. We'll be receiving planning funds as well for the state digital equity plan as well. Those two products do need to mesh together. And so we'll have
Two separate sources of funds. NTIA says that they have to speak to one another, even though technically you don't have to use them both. But they say use them both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Onerous federal funding requirements.
So we essentially have to develop a 5-year action plan. Again, kind of backwards on NTIA's process. We have to develop a 5-year action plan to address areas we don't know about yet with money we don't know we have yet. It's very convoluted. But anyways, again, we're going to go back to almost the same kind of process that we did with the state broadband listening tour. We're going to request, involvement from all players across the state to be involved with that 5-year action plan to help us understand how to address IIJA funds with the requirements that we need to follow along to. Unserved areas first, underserved areas, community anchor institutions, utilizing, one thing that is interesting about IIJA, if you have an area that you get satellite service from, but just satellite service, that area is unserved. You have an area that you have wireless, that's unlicensed spectrum, that area is unserved, no matter what speed you're getting it at. So these are little different wrinkles that we didn't expect. One thing we'll also do is IIJA is asking, or NTIA rather, is asking states to remove or waive legal barriers that might prohibit, municipal networks and other areas. I think John highlighted that there are some areas in state law that might prohibit, that prohibit rather than promote broadband expansion. So, and Comptroller Hager talked about utilizing some state funding. So this is going to be just a lot of conversations we have with legislative offices as we move into the 88th legislative session on how can we promote, greater broadband through that process as far as addressing or relieving some of the state laws that we have within the state. So we'll be having those conversations as well as a lead up to that 2024 timeline that IIJA or NTIA put out. But we'll be essentially just doing a lot more planning, developing those 5-year plans concurrently with the CPF funding that we'll be getting out the door. So by the time we get to that 2024 period, we'll have already done, a lot of the CPF funding, and we'll already be in a good spot as far as that grant process and having that all worked out.
So we've touched quite a bit on the planning process and how y'all are already working with NTIA and other federal partners to communicate some of where these federal requirements may be a little challenging to implement state level. But let's talk about how you actually want to make these programs work for Texas. Competing timelines, overlapping requirements, sometimes that don't always speak to one another. But this is a great opportunity. So how do you want to make this work for Texas?
I think as we continue to plan out, as we see how the CPF funds work for us, we'll be seeing kind of other abilities for that matching component. Can we work with that? But also kind of exploring other areas where we can help communities, access these funds in a quicker way, but also deploy the funds in a quicker way as well. Some of the things we talked about earlier was, supply chain, workforce development, things like that, and where are the areas that we can sort of address. If you talk to ISPs now, some are saying that it's going to take them 2 years to get fiber. And if we have a program like CPF or IIJA that has requested states utilize fiber as a dominant technology within those, as we put these programs online, all 50 states now are using CPF or IIJA funding for fiber projects. What's that going to do to the fiber supply chain? What is that going to do to workforce? And so as a state, what can we do to address the needs that alleviate flashpoints like that? With IIJA, you have Buy America policies. So We can't offshore any of those resources either. So we're confined to a finite source. So what can we do as a state to alleviate some of those pressures? And that's certainly something that we're looking at, myself and Comptroller Hager. As we were talking about the NTIA rules, we kind of talked about that yesterday and said that's maybe something that we can also too explore. So that readiness, that preparedness for our communities, we're going to be looking at that to make sure our communities are prepared as we move forward.
All right, final question, 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. I know your planning process, you're setting goals,
Yep.
and again, federal funding requirements. But what will success look like? What are you thinking that success looks like today?
I think success looks like, in 5, 10, 5, 8, well, now that we have the kind of the timeline on the 2024 with a 4-year burn for these, I say 5 to 8 years. I'd love to work myself out of a job and to work this office out of a job. I don't think that, I think success is in 5 to 8 years. If we look at the Broadband Development Office and say, what are you still here for, man? We don't need you anymore. I think that's success for us. And the fact that, we have access, every house, every business, every community anchor institution has the ability to sign on. We've addressed the digital equity component as far as making sure that, our communities, our underrepresented communities particularly, do have the access skills and abilities to access the internet. And everybody can understand the importance of why we just did what we did, why we just spent $1 to $4 billion. And I think for us, that's what success looks like. And I hope that that's kind of where we get to. And I hope, and as we use that funding, that's what we'll be shooting for. So,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you.